Hello, everybody. Oh no, the webcam isn't working. Hello. Hello? Yeah, okay, cool. Just checking that's working. Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Welcome to my talk, Mastery is for You, by me, Joseph Allen, a Manchester-based web developer, data scientist, and digital artist. First of all, I ask that you validate me. If you're watching this, please check out my Twitter and just retweet it, or say you're doing this. You're watching this at lunch and just enjoying yourself, and generally things like that. Ah, perfect. Thank you. I'm just I've got all my streams set up and stuff over here. So if I'm looking over here, I'm just reading the chat and stuff like that. Yeah. So welcome. Let's get on with it. So disclaimer: this is a very sad story about my year in industry experience. But luckily it has a happy ending, and I think there's some good morals, so hopefully you find that. So let's go back in time. It's 2015. I've just turned 20 years old, and I've got a love for HTML and CSS. I've been doing some freelance work, building websites in my spare time for very low-paying clients. And I decided to do a year in industry, basically because everyone else around me was doing one. And I thought I'd like to graduate with those friends, and also it might be nice to take a little break from academia. So with this love of HTML and CSS, and just generally being creative, the path of web development seemed kind of obvious to me. One sec. So I'd seen some other people applying to a bunch of sort of small agencies, and heard some good stories about people's experiences with them. So I thought I'd apply to a bunch of small agencies, and I got a job at an agency. Why isn't the audio playing? Normally at this point it'll go dun dun dun, but it doesn't seem to want to do it right now. So I did get a job at an agency. Now, I appreciate that not all agencies are bad places to work, but there's sort of quite an infamous reputation that agencies overwork their staff, which makes sense, due to the sort of rapid changes of projects and potential deadlines and things like that. So yeah, sadly this agency did fit that reputation quite nicely. Very quickly, I'm just going to deviate over to a book recommendations. This book, Start With Why, basically asks you to question why you do things instead of what you're doing. And it's very useful sort of as a sales technique, that your business won't make sense if you don't understand why you're pursuing that business or why you believe that business is a good idea. You can't just sell a laptop. You have to believe why you're selling that laptop has meaning, and because of that the customers will believe it too. So it's quite useful to sort of look at why you're doing things instead of what you're doing. So in this case, my why was that I wanted to grow my success and earn the respect of those around me. I wanted to be able to walk around Manchester and be like, oh, I made the website for that restaurant, they give me a discount, things like that. Just this sort of like sense of value. So my how for that would be surrounding myself with people I can learn from and people I respect, and hopefully eventually that sort of will transition to a more mutual relationship where we're constantly learning from each other and respecting each other. And my what for this was a job at an agency that felt like the right thing to set me on a path to this why that would help me grow this success. Sadly, it wasn't really that. It's what I would now call a Codemonkey role. So the job was just around minimum wage, although each of our hours were billed at £65 an hour. So we were making about £8 an hour, and the company was making 65. There was no focus on mastery, no time to learn, there was no testing, there was no review process. So we really suffered for that. There could have been a lot more growth. There was no version control. So if anyone uploaded a new file, it would overwrite the file there. So if two people were working on the same website at the same time, we would constantly be like overwriting each other's work. And about a third of the company were interns, so there was very little sort of mentor to mentee relationship. And I can't don't think I could be more negative than that. It was at this point I realized I was having a pretty rough time in my year in industry. So I decided to sort of ask my friends around me what they think. At the time, I was on around £15,000 a year. So, you know, it was enough to make a big impact on my decisions as a university student, but not particularly rewarding considering the stress. The feedback I got from other people, at least you have a job. That's good money, don't quit. Live to work or work to live. Jobs aren't supposed to be fun. And I got, oh well, you know, that's life. So aside from, you know, seeing some of my friends having much more positive experiences of their job, the work culture sounded so fun, and I was just generally bored with the tech I was working on. Everything else was going great. And yeah, that's life, I guess. So when I started this job, you know, I was still working freelance. I was still building websites in my free time. I was trying to learn to set up the technology that we used at this job because I figured, you know, if I'm going to be here for a year, I'm going to get 40 hours a week of dedicated learning time for this CMS that we're using. So I may as well get something out of it. But I didn't really believe it was a good tool. You know, every time I tried to set it up, you know, hosting was difficult, like building something was difficult. And it just didn't make sense as a tool. So that direction had sort of been lost. You know, I thought this was the right step on that path. And very quickly that motivation died out too. You know, I didn't want to spend my evenings making websites anymore because I was just burning out from it. It didn't make sense. Now, luckily, I wasn't alone. There was one other co-worker who was having a very similar experience to me. He worked hard, and he was also filling his spare time with just fun things. You know, we would spend our lunch times recording comedy podcasts or doing some like music production stuff. He would spend his evenings going to like music mastery night school to do editing and stuff like that. And I think he was probably the only person in this office that was encouraging to that mastery culture. And yeah, that's a weird picture of him. And that's because I told him about this talk, and I said, what picture do you want me to use of you? Do you want to be involved? And this is the one he told me to use. So he's still choosing to have fun over being professional, I guess. But I'm you know, I'd love to work with him again, and I wish the office was filled with people like him. So now 3 months have passed. It's time for my probation meeting. At this point, you know, I don't think I'm doing a bad job. I thought I was doing pretty good, but I didn't really agree with the technical decisions, and I didn't have experience of any other job to sort of recognize what was normal. So all of this dev process felt quite normal to me. And I was told it's not too late to go back to university. You know, that sentence like rings in my head. That, you know, I feel like I wasn't good enough. I was told that the other employees were coming in over the weekends to do work, so why wasn't I? I was told I was disappointing in every way. I was, you know, like say other employees were working weekends. Now at this point, I hadn't eaten lunch in a month. I hadn't even taken the lunch break. I hadn't left the office at lunchtime. And they hadn't noticed. Like, I called it out in the meeting, and I was like, I'm working more than expected. But I kind of realized that they weren't going to listen to that. Over these few months, I'd lost 16 kilograms. And I was just like in survival mode, you know. I was trading that mental well-being and that health for the small amount of money I was receiving, for like no respect. And I very much felt like I was in this, you know, survival mode where I was just going into work. And I realized in that probation meeting, you know, I couldn't call out like, but I have been working hard, but I have been doing, you know, giving in the extra effort that frankly they didn't deserve. And I realized that just wasn't going to work. Like, there's no way they were going to listen to accusations in the probation meeting where they decide whether I get to keep my job. So I just begged for that second chance, which they gave to me. And I kind of think they only did it because they would have felt guilty if they let me go, really. And I have a lot of opinions around like hiring and probation type stuff, and I firmly believe that if your staff are entering a probation meeting and they're worried, that is a failure on the management side of things. Or if your decision for probation disagrees with how they think they're doing, that's a failure on management, right? If someone's doing a poor job, you should give them the opportunity to improve themselves. So I'd failed at work, by their words, but for some reason I hadn't been fired. And yeah, that's a pretty confusing one for me. I stopped getting given this extra work. I was on a large project that was quoted at something like £96,000 that took about 3 months to develop. And from that, I had apparently not been trustworthy, and now I was only getting given small bug fixes, if anything. If you've ever worked a job where there wasn't enough to do, you'll know just how boring it is to be a sort of a bum in a seat, just sat there for 8 hours when there's nothing to do. But luckily I had a bit more creative time. And because of that, I could sort of start looking into things that I wanted to learn. And I started to realize that there were more advanced tools and extensions to HTML and CSS where I could be a better developer, and I could bring that back to work as well. So I started using those skills for good instead of evil. I wasn't trying to make money out of them. I was just trying to learn. I was trying to have fun. I started making something like this, which was using the Meteor framework and WebKit transitions and CSS animations. And this. So this is just little CSS animations, just changing the border radius as a HTML property. And I just feel like that stuff is so much more interesting than what I was working on before. And in just those 2 projects, I'd learned CSS transitions, WebKit filters, Sass, which is like a processed version of CSS. I'd used Grunt to automatically rebuild that every time I saved files. I'd used the Meteor framework purely for its templating so that I could write one component and use it 9 times to make these many different faces. And I also started using Git and GitHub purely because I didn't want to bring a thumb drive into work. I just wanted to be able to transfer these files so I could look at them when I was getting home. Like, totally using these things for complete nonsense, but those things are so valuable and still things that I use now. I definitely don't use the CMS I was using in that first job anymore. And more justifiably, I brought that back to the office, right? I had this change of perspective. It wasn't about finishing the project or finishing the brief. It was about, hey, here's a cool thing I've done. We could use this. We changed a client's like hover transitions from just being, an active state to having these like triangles that were their brand colors, like flying in, and using that rotating like hue shift to make them change from a black and white image of the staff to the brand colors as well. And it was just like, that was a lot of fun. That was my favorite part from working that awful job. And that attitude sort of bubbled out, and I realized, I could be working somewhere where people do treat me with a bit more respect, and do, care about learning. So I started asking, could I find a better job? And I did. And I moved somewhere else with what's called flexi time. You don't have to come in at 9 a.m. every day. They had mastery time dedicated on a Friday, so for 2 hours we could do whatever we wanted to. And that freedom and that, that was motivating. And just seeing that on my like trial day made me just think like, oh my gosh, like I hope I can work here, like it was such a breath of fresh air. And the weird thing is, I've worked 4 or 5 jobs now, and every company has been exponentially better than the last. And it's really frustrating to know that there are still companies like that first company and people thinking that's normal when they enter the industry. And then it was time to go back to uni. Again, there's an audio clip missing here. Should go bum bum bum. So it was time to go back to university. I'd had this great experience in the second half of my year in industry. I had to pick a 3rd-year project. And the title that made a lot of sense to me was building a website using a modern framework. And I was already good at, I was okay at HTML, CSS, and okay at JavaScript. But I knew that if I did this I could learn these things on the job, or I could learn these with my own personal project. Like if I was going to dedicate myself to something for a year, I didn't want it to be so limited to things that I was already quite comfortable with. So instead I picked using technology to assist artists. And I picked this because it was so vague and it was so creative. And I knew that I wouldn't know what my final project would be when I started it. So there was a lot more exploration. It was just about, figuring out what would be useful to an artist, but also, figuring out what would be fun to learn. And it kind of gave me that flexibility. And eventually settled on this title of change detection for digital art, focusing on sort of image processing. I built this using something called processing, which is a confusing name. And my mastery time while I was at work was spent looking at this. I'd actually been looking at this software since I was still working that first job, and that was one of the things I looked into in my spare time, I guess. Processing is a software sketchbook that's designed to help digital artists get into programming. So it's got some very simple functions, things like, ellipses to draw circles or square to draw squares. All of the mouse cursor events are very easy to access compared to other libraries, so it's really easy to make something interactive. And as a more confident programmer, using this tool that was built for digital artists was much more accessible. Using processing, I started making weird side projects. I made this project called Frame by Frame, which takes a YouTube video and gets sort of the average color or most prominent colors from each frame and builds this sort of movie barcode. My idea here was that you could create abstract versions of entire movies or movie trailers, or even like personal family videos, and you could have that as like a product, and it was starting to look at these things with a out of curiosity, like with the intent of learning image processing, but at the same time, like, could it be a passive income stream? Could it be something more than just fun, or could it buy more time for fun, right? I mean, this, like, I don't know, I was pretty bored at the time. It's just 3 images that I drew with like a digital pen. And I also drew the weird monster thing at the back, which is moving using something called Perlin noise. So you could make something randomly move left or right, but eventually it would, it could possibly go off screen or stuff like that. And Perlin noise is just like one of these weird techniques that I learned when I was just trying to make like weird random ant walking animations, And then the snow falling is just circles, and they're all either rotating in the x-axis or y-axis. So it's really simple in what you're, from the programming perspective. And a lot of these projects are sort of a small amount of programming using a very accessible tool. I also made this around when David Bowie died. Oh, the videos are muted, that's why. You should be able to hear that now. Perfect. Oh, yeah. So that's also using processing. They've got a library for audio visualizations, and it's just using the volumes of random parts of the sample to draw the circles, and the color of those circles is just random, I think. Oh, that's good. Now we're going to have those audio cues that I'm so dependent on. Also, over this time, I became a moderator of r/processing. I think from academia, we're so used to sort of having a mark scheme or a rubric or something to like work through. So that with that syllabus, we have this guidance, and we can say like, oh yes, I know processing now because I did this syllabus. And when I came to processing, I didn't really find that. I didn't find a list of online challenges I could work through, so I decided to make my own. And I thought it'd be useful if I could see other people's responses as well. So I sort of started posting on the processing subreddit, and the moderators made me a moderator so that I could manage it myself. We also had some open source projects where we built a calculator, we tried to build a chess set, and we tried to build Guitar Hero in processing as well, just to teach, the ability to use GitHub with more confidence. And this kind of gave me my first sense of community that I now sort of have built up on with PyData Manchester. It was just more motivating, like I could have built these things for money, but it wouldn't have meant anything, but building them for fun and seeing what other people did with the same prompts and the discussions around them was just so much more motivating. So I finished my third year project. This is it. Also in processing, just using image processing to separate a foreground and background layer. And then to make it useful to the artists, it was allowing them to put any image or video or coded example on the foreground or background separately. That's me, looking cool, Joe. Yes. Okay. And then it was time to go back to the real world. So academia was over. I returned to work as a data scientist. Those of you that don't know what a data scientist is, it's sort of a conglomeration of 3 different industries. So data engineering is just involving moving data from one place to another, maybe transforming it so it's in a more useful format. Data analysis is about sort of looking at the past and the present and visualizing it and trying to make decisions off that. And then machine learning is about utilizing that past and present so that maybe we can predict the future. And there were some amazing skills that I learned from just diving into that very briefly that I'd never even heard of before. Things like sentiment analysis, just general machine learning and predicting things. And that attitude of could I do this, could I build this, sort of became how can we misuse this technology that is being used so heavily in in the e-commerce world. How can we misuse this for sort of fun little projects? At the time, some of my friends were being very negative on WhatsApp and swearing and a lot of stuff like that. And I said, guys, you're stressing me out with all this negativity. I think I'm being a lot more positive, and I think you could try and be a bit more positive too. So I used sentiment analysis and the pandas library to analyze an exported WhatsApp chat, which you can just do in the settings of any WhatsApp chat. And just going through that, and I did scientifically prove here that I send more positive messages than they do by percentage. And yeah, so that made me pretty popular with them. I took this further with a funded art piece in Bristol, which was a rose that you could tweet. This was extending the same code base by maybe about 20 to 40 lines of Python. This was a rose that you could tweet at, and if you sent it something nice, you said like, I love you, Rose, it would water the rose. And if you sent it something like, I hate you, you're an ugly rose, it would poison the rose, and it would also have there was some black dye mixed in with that poison. So as the rose died, it would sort of get this like corrupted, veiny look. And obviously if nobody tweets it, it gets dehydrated and dies anyway. So there's a metaphor there. And so at this point, I'd learned so many things just for fun, just for like personal projects, so much more than that CMS of that first job. And it was my choice, it was my agency, and it was just so much more motivating. And a lot of these things had benefits that I brought back to work. A lot of them didn't. Unity is a game development engine. Like that wasn't really useful at any job I've had so far. It might be in the future, but there was still programming experience. There was still sort of creative experience in trying to think about programming problems more logically and building assets for them and stuff like that. And it brings in this question of like fun versus professionalism. Like, is there value in doing things for fun? And I sort of recently reviewed some CVs and they all had portfolio sites attached. And it made me sort of question what's the purpose of a portfolio site? Because I saw a lot like this. So this is my professional portfolio site, which is actually just a template for GitHub pages. So, I didn't do most of this. It just came with the template. And it looks good. If someone asked me to make a professional site, I think this proves that I can make a professional looking site. But if someone applied to me and I saw this, I would probably say that's a template, and I'd probably look for their GitHub and try and find evidence that they can actually code beyond changing the HTML and the copy. I can't get out of here. So I also have a second site. Just checking that audio is working. So this is like my more fun version of the same site. It's, I made all these assets in the background that I thought represented me at the time. There's some stuff playing saxophone, so I was playing saxophone at the time. It's got pretty much the same content, but I just had a lot more fun while I was making it. And it's a bit messy. It probably doesn't work very well on mobile. But I think it just shows, should the purpose of these portfolio sites be to blend in and sort of be noticeably a template, or is it to stand out? And I think together they show those skills, and they show the benefit of what it means to sort of have a more fun approach to programming. So I'll sort of leave you with these two axioms. If you can still learn, I think you're valuable, right? You've still got time to catch up. You've still got time to learn a new skill, right? It's not really acceptable to assume somebody can't do something if they're still making the effort to learn things. And if you're having fun, you're learning more. This has been proven. Gamification improves retention. It makes us work harder. It makes us work longer. So some businesses won't give you mastery time. Mastery time is just dedicated time for learning whatever you want, really. It doesn't have to be applicable. Mastery is considered one of the 3 great motivators, and I can, anecdotally, I definitely agree with that. It's probably the perk I look for most when I'm looking for employment. And there are people that are quite, allergic to this new modern development where we have these expectations around agile development and improved perks. If people in your office say they don't need mastery time, that that's on them. That's their agency to not use that mastery time. But if there's one person in the office that would benefit from it, I think you owe it to yourself to try and help them as a mentor get that mastery time. And I found that if you sort of climb up the ladder of technical management, at some point there's probably someone you can convince, and if there isn't, at least you tried. So my hopes for you all: pick up one of your dev projects, start a new project for fun. If you're at work, ask for mastery time, talk about those benefits, and make sure you respect yourselves. Like, nothing is worth, that trade-off for mental health, really. Like, you can enjoy your job and still see it as a job. Just a quick disclaimer: I don't resent that first web agency, though I may have spoken about them very negatively. Without them, I know that I wouldn't have these views now, and I wouldn't be able to talk to you about it like I am now. And also my hope, 5 years have passed. I'm hoping now that they've sort of clocked onto these modern practices and they've learned some of these lessons themselves. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. Are there any questions? I'll just leave it for a minute. Just looking at the YouTube chat. If you do like the sort of live streaming that I've just done, check out streammymeetup.com. We can stream your meetup. You handle the guests and we handle the rest. We got a comment. Brilliant. All right, well, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. If you leave any questions in the comments, I'll come back to them. Thank you very much for watching, everybody.